As Father Riz told you, the subject of this seminar will be the responsibility of the artist. Does it matter what one writes? What one writes is of no consequence. This was a motto some 20 years ago of those who advocated the so-called gratuitousness of art. To be able to think freely, André Gide said after Ernest Renan, one must be certain that what one writes will be of no consequence. And he went on to say, the artist is expected to appear after dinner. His function is not to provide food, but intoxication. And again, in a dialogue between himself and an imaginary interlocutor, the interlocutor, are you interested in moral questions? Gide, what? The very stuff of our books. The interlocutor, but what is morality according to you? Gide, a branch of aesthetics. Thus, the problem of art and morality was posed in crude terms. Let us not try to escape the singular harshness of this problem. The fact is that by nature, art and morality are two autonomous powers with no direct and intrinsic subordination between one another. There is a subordination, but extrinsic and indirect. It is this extrinsic and indirect subordination which is disregarded both by the anarchistic claim to have the artist completely irresponsible, it does not matter what one writes, then any subordination whatever of art to morality is simply denied, and at the extreme opposite, by the totalitarian claim to have the artist completely subservient. What one writes must be controlled by the state. Then the fact of the subordination being only extrinsic and indirect is simply denied. This first meeting will be of an introductory nature. It will deal with the most general abstract principles which the discussion of the issue presupposes. Thus, I should like to say a few words, first about the realm of art, second about the realm of morality, and to lay stress on the fact that these two realms are of themselves as I just said, two autonomous worlds, but within the unity of the human subject. The second lecture will deal with art for art's sake, the third with the motto, the contrary motto, art for the people, and the last and fourth will deal with poetry and the perfection of human life. Before embarking on a discussion on the realm of art, I should like to remark that in speaking of art, we are speaking of art in the artist, in the soul and creative dynamism of the artist, or as a particular energy or vital power which we have to consider in itself or to disengage in its nature, in its essence, but which exists within man and which man uses to achieve a good work. He uses not only his hands, but that inner specific principle of activity which develops in his own soul. According to Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, art is a virtue that is an innerly developed, undeviating strength. Art is a virtue of the practical intellect, that particular virtue of the practical intellect which deals with the creation of objects to be made. But in contradistinction to prudence, which is also a perfection of the practical intellect, art is concerned with the good of the work, not with the good of man. The ancients took pleasure in laying stress on this difference, in their thoroughgoing comparison between art and prudence. If only he contrives a good piece of woodwork or jewel work, the fact of a craftsman being spiteful or debauched is immaterial, just as it is immaterial for a geometer to be a jealous or wicked man, if only his demonstrations provide us with geometrical truths. As Thomas Aquinas put it, art in this respect resembles the virtue of the speculative intellect. It causes man to act in a right way, not with regard to the use of man's own free will and to the rightness of the human will, but with regard to the rightness of a particular operating power. The good that art pursues is not the good of the human will, but the good of the very artifact. Thus, art does not require as a necessary precondition that the will or appetite should be straight or undeviating with respect to its own nature and its own human or moral ends and dynamism, or in the line of human destiny. Oscar Wilde was but a good Thomist, we observed last year, when he wrote, "The fact of a man being a poisoner is nothing against his prose." As Thomas Aquinas put it, the kind of good which art pursues is not the good of the human will or appetite, or the good of man, but the good of the very works done or artifacts. And consequently, art does not presuppose rectitude of the appetite in the line of the human good. Prima Secundae, question 57, Article 4. Here we are confronted with one of the basic principles which hold sway over the issue that we are tackling. This principle needs to be correctly understood and correctly applied. It needs to be counterbalanced by other basic principles which pertain to the field of morality. Over and above all, it has to be complemented by the consideration of the fact that the artist is not art itself, or an impersonation of art come down from some Platonic separate heaven. The artist is a man, the artist is a man using art. Yet the principle in question holds true and must never be forgotten. Art by itself tends to the good of the work, not to the good of man. The first responsibility of the artist as such is toward his work. I am now summing up considerations of art which I had an opportunity of expounding last year, but it's only a summary. Aristotelian philosophy insists that the practical intellect works always, one way or another, in conjunction with the will, and that in practical knowledge, truth is the conformity of the intellect with the straight appetite. This statement applies to art and prudence in totally different manners. In the case of prudence, it is insofar as the appetite tends to the ends of human life that it plays an indispensable part in practical knowledge. And truth is conformity with the straight will or appetite, insofar as the appetite has been made straight by moral virtues. But in the case of art, the will plays its part insofar as it tends to the ends of the work, and the fact of the will or appetite being straight means that it tends to the ends of the work as to be attained by means of the rules discovered by the intellect, so that the judgment of the artist about each of the movements his fingers have to make is true when it is in conformity with the appetite straightly tending toward this work as to be done through the appropriate rules. Thus, in the last analysis, the main part is played by the intellect, and art is much more intellectual than prudence. Now, as concerns especially the fine arts, because in the fine arts, the work to be made is an end in itself and a certain singular and original, totally unique participation in beauty. Reason alone is not enough for the artist to form and conceive this work within himself in an infallible creative judgment. For, as Aristotle put it, as everyone is, so does the end appear to him. Everyone judges of his own ends when they engage his own self, in accordance with what he himself actually is. And since the final transcendent end, in the case of the final arts, is beauty, not a particular need to be satisfied, but beauty to be seduced, such a spiritual and transcendental, self-sufficient, absolute, all-exacting end demands that the very self and subjectivity of the artist should be committed to it. As a result, in order for the artist to form and conceive his work within himself in an infallible creative judgment, it is necessary that his subjective dynamism, his will and appetite straightly tend to beauty. At this point, the statement that the truth of the practical intellect consists in conformity with the straight appetite takes on a new meaning. And we see that the fine arts, though they are more fully intellectual than the useful arts, imply, however, a much greater and more essential part played by the appetite, and require that the love for beauty should make the intellect co-natured with beauty. Because in the last analysis, in art as in contemplation, intellectuality at its peak goes beyond concepts and discursive reason, and is achieved through a congeniality or connaturality with the object, which love alone can bring about. Every picture, Sisley said, shows a spot with which the artist himself has fallen in love. To produce a work in beauty, the artist must be in love with beauty. Such undeviating love is a supra-artistic rule, a precondition, not sufficient as to the ways of making, yet necessary as to the vital animation of art, which is presupposed by all the rules of art. And this very fact helps us to realize how deeply, how totally the artist is engaged in his work. He is entirely committed, entirely given. He serves an absolute, he loves an absolute, he is captive of the absoluteness of a love which exacts his whole being. flesh and spirit. It cannot consent to any division. What I have just said about the absolute exigencies of beauty may be said about the absolute exigencies of poetry. This is only another way of expressing the same truth. At this point, I should like to make clear that I am using the word poetry in a quite general sense, as general as the way in which Plato used the word music. Poetry does not mean, for me, a particular art, the art of writing verses. It means something common to all arts, especially to all fine arts, and which is closely linked to what we call inspiration. I have no time to discuss now the nature of poetry. I would only say that poetry, in the general sense I just pointed to, implies the actual release of the pure creativity of the spirit and a living contact with reality, in which the things of the world, or rather some inside aspect or meaning, concrete and existential, of these things, are reached and known through emotion, so that both the world and the subjectivity of the poet are obscurely revealed to him together. Such an experience is ineffable in itself, being totally singular. It cannot be expressed by concepts within the mind. It can be expressed only by the work outside the mind. That it is that such an experience tends necessarily to creation. It can achieve creation only by means of art, of some particular art, music, architecture, painting, poetry, and so forth, but of itself it transcends art, strictly taken as a specific virtue of working reason, which deals with means of execution and the rational construction of the work. Poetry might be called the heaven of working reason. The construction of a symphony with its motifs, its themes, its rhythm, its harmonic structure, brings into play the whole virtue of art of the composer. The invention of melody is a gift which comes from poetic experience. Well, it is relevant to insist here on the crucial part played by poetic intuition in the fine arts. In useful arts, however important and necessary, the secondary, more and more refined rules discovered by the craftsman may be, his primary obligation is to the primary rule, which is in his case the satisfying of a certain need, toward which, from the very start, his will basically tends. Now, what is this primary rule in the case of the fine arts? In this case, the appetite, together with the intellect, basically tends to the release of the pure creativity of the spirit in its longings for beauty. Consequently, the primary rule is the vital actuation or determination through which this free creativity of the spirit expresses itself first and foremost, and to which, therefore, the mind and the hand of the artist must first of all be loyal. In other words, it is this creative or poetic intuition to which the entire work to be engendered in beauty in its perfect singularity as a kind of unique cosmos is appendant. In creative intuition, we have the primary rule, to which, in the case of the fine arts, the whole fidelity obedience and heedfulness of the artist must be committed. Here again we are confronted with an absolute to which the artist as such is entirely committed. Be it added parenthetically that creative intuition does not make superfluous the rules of working reason. On the contrary, it demands to use them as a necessary instrument. When the resourcefulness of discursive reason and working reason and the rules involved, the secondary rules, are used as an instrument of creative intuition, they compose the indispensable arsenal of prudence, shrewdness, and cleverness of the life of art. It is at all that the French painter Degas pointed when he said, a painting is a thing which requires as much cunning, rascality, and viciousness as the perpetration of a crime. Here is a bit of truth, I note it in passing, that we may find in Gide's saying, another saying of André Gide. He said, the devil contributes to any work of art. What Gide intended to say was quite different. We shall have to discuss it later on. At the present moment, we have only to do with a quite innocent devil, the devil of the shrewdness and trickiness in applying the rules. I have just insisted that art taken in itself tends to the good of the work, not to the good of man, and that its transcendent end is beauty, an absolute which admits of no division. Now we shall deal with the other side of the medal, the opposite aspect of our problem, no longer with the realm of art, but with the realm of morality, no longer with the order of making, but with the order of doing, no longer with the practical activity of human reason as directed toward the good of the work to be made, but with the practical activity of human reason as directed toward the good of human life to be reached through the exercise of freedom. A man can be wealthy, successful, powerful, etc. He can be a good businessman, a good political boss, a good rancher, and be at the same time a bad man. A man can be endowed with exceptional intelligence and possess every kind of knowledge. He can be a great scientist or a great philosopher and be at the same time a bad man. A man can be a great artist and be a bad man. What causes a man to be purely and simply good is the goodness of his deeds as expressing his will. It is the action which achieves his being and emanates from him as a man, that is, as a person master of himself and capable of working out his own destiny, or as a free agent. Now, what is the determining quality which causes my action to be good? Good means fullness of being. Now, anything attains the fullness of its own being when it is formed according to the form required by its nature. And because man is an animal endowed with reason, the form which is essentially required by his nature for his action to possess fullness of being is the form of reason. A human action is good, purely and simply good, or morally good, when it is formed by reason or measured according to reason. Conformity with reason or consonance with reason, that is, conformity with what causes a man to be a man, is what causes a human action to be good. Well, the fact of a human action being good or bad constitutes its intrinsic moral value. We have thus brought out the notion of value, moral value. This notion of moral value has nothing to do with that of aesthetic or artistic value. Virtue is spiritually beautiful, and the Greeks had a single word, kalokagatos, beautiful and good, to designate the moral good. But this intrinsic beauty or nobility of the good moral action does not relate to a work to be made. It relates to the exercise of human freedom. Furthermore, it is not good as a means to an end, it is good in itself, what the ancients called bonum honestum, the quality of an act good for the sake of good. Here we are not confronted with a good state of affairs, meaning an advantageous or useful state of affairs. We are confronted with that goodness, beauty or nobility which comes to a human act from its conformity with reason, which is an end in itself, a good in itself. Artistic value and moral value belong to two different realms. Artistic value relates to the work, moral value to man. The sins of man can be the subject matter of a work of art. From them, art can draw aesthetic beauty. Otherwise, there would not be novelists. The experience of moral evil can even contribute to feed the virtue of art, I mean by accident, not as a necessary requirement of art. The fact remains that the artist, as I said a moment ago, is not art itself, he is primarily a man, and he is a man before being a painter or a composer. With the notion of value, we are in a static order, so to speak, in the order of what Aristotle called formal causality. When it comes to the dynamic order, to the order of exercise or effectuation into existence, we are confronted with another component of the realm of morality, with the notion of end and of ultimate end. For by necessity of nature, man cannot exercise his freedom, man cannot act except in the desire for happiness. But what is man's happiness? What does human happiness consist of? This is not inscribed in the necessary functioning of his nature. This is above this necessary functioning, because man is a free agent. Thus, he has to decide for himself what kind of supreme good his happiness consists of. In actual fact, he must choose his own happiness or supreme good. And the fate of his moral life depends on the fact of this choice being made or not according to the truth of the matter. This means that in the order of exercise, which is the dynamic and existential order of final causality, the enforcement with respect to any choice engaging our whole personality and the whole direction of our life, the enforcement of the moral good into actual existence, implies that we direct our life toward the subsisting good as our supreme good. The entire moral order, the entire realm of morality, is thus appendant to a love, which is love for God as supreme ruler of human life. Nay more, according to Christian data, which is love for God as loving us first and causing us to participate in his own life. Such is not the case with the realm of art. Art and poetry tend to an absolute, which is beauty to be attained in a work, but which is not God himself, nor beauty subsisting by itself. When Jean Cocteau said at the end of Orpheus, "Because poetry, my God, it's you," this did not mean that poetry is God himself, but that God is the prime poet, and that poetry receives all its virtue from him. The absolute toward which art and poetry are directed is a supreme good and an ultimate end in a given order, in the order of the creativity of the spirit. It is not the absolutely supreme good and absolutely ultimate end. What the artist, he does so insofar as he is a man, not insofar as he is an artist. Now, another point concerning this realm of morality. What about the feeling of moral obligation? This feeling depends on the inner constraint exercised on our will by our intellect. From the very fact that it knows the good and the bad, that is to say, moral values. For we cannot want to be bad. We cannot want to do evil insofar as it is evil. Hence, when we know that something is bad and therefore should be avoided, by the same stroke we feel bound not to do it. Moral obligation does not proceed from social taboos. Moral obligation is a constraint exercised by the intellect on the will. Now, a basic distinction must be made. When we consider things in an abstract and theoretical manner, we see human actions in their pure and universal moral essence, separately from what we are at a given moment, and from the tissue or concrete circumstances in which we are involved at this given moment. We see, for instance, that murder is bad. This murder, which fits my anger, is bad. If I do it, I shall be bad, and I cannot want to be bad. This vision binds me. I am bound in conscience. This is moral obligation which takes place at the level of the abstract consideration of moral essences taken in themselves. But there is another level, purely practical this time, the level of the actual choice, of the act of freedom. Then I can make a choice contrary to my conscience. and contrary to moral obligation. Because then I do not consider murder, for instance, in its pure and universal moral essence, but with respect to what I am and desire and love and prefer here and now. I can say this act is bad and forbidden by the law, but my good in that which I love most is to satisfy my anger. Then I make murder to be what I love best, and so much for the worse for the universal law. Then I choose murder not because it is bad, but because in respect to concrete circumstances and to the love which I freely make prevalent in me, it is good for me, but not morally good. And in order to choose it, it is necessary that at the very instant of my act of choice, I divert my eyes from the vision of this action as morally bad, as morally evil. Or, as Thomas Aquinas puts it, that I divert my eyes from the consideration of the rule. In such a case, I act against the moral obligation which binds me. The fact remains that I am morally obliged. And I am morally obliged to avoid evil because if I do evil, I shall be bad, and because I cannot want to be bad. By virtue of the very nature of my will, I feel bound in conscience or in my perception of the abstract and universal moral essence of human acts, not to do what would make me bad. That which takes place with the moral conscience of man as man is exactly what takes place with regard to the artistic conscience of the artist, as well as with the medical conscience of the physician, or with the scientific conscience of the scientist. The artist cannot want to be bad as an artist. His artistic conscience binds him not to sin against his art, for the simple fact that this would be bad in the sphere of artistic values. Tell a Rouault or a Cézanne to change his style and to do more pleasing painting, bad painting, in order to be accepted at the annual exhibition of French artists and make a living and support his family and fulfill his moral obligation toward his wife and his children, even assuming that his family is starving, he will answer, "Get out and leave me alone, you damn intruder." To follow such advice would be against his artistic conscience, his conscience as a painter. To support his family, an artist may have to become a farmer or a custom officer as Hawthorne or Henri Rousseau, or even he may have to give up art. He can never accept to be a bad artist and spoil his work. I have known a great writer who had also an extraordinary gift for drawing. When he was a young man, he made drawings which had some kinship with those of William Blake. But he felt that in doing so, he obeyed a sort of dark inspiration, with, so to speak, a forbidden easiness. He thought he was guided by the devil. Then he completely gave up drawing. This was possible for him, but if it would not have been possible for him to spoil his drawings in betraying his vision. At this point, a serious issue arises, which we shall discuss in a further meeting, and a remark which seems quite important to me can be made right now. For an artist to spoil his work and sin against his art is forbidden by his artistic conscience. But what about his moral conscience? Is not his moral conscience also involved? My answer is yes. Not only his artistic conscience, but his moral conscience also, his conscience as a man, is here on the alert. For moral conscience deals with all the acts of a man. Moral conscience envelops, so to speak, all the more particularized kinds of conscience, not moral in themselves, but artistic, medical, scientific, etc., of which I just spoke. There are no precepts in natural law or in the Decalogue dealing with painting and poetry, prescribing a particular style or forbidding another. But there is a primary principle in moral matters which states that it is always bad and always forbidden to act against one's own conscience. The artist who, yielding to ill-advised moral exhortations, decides to betray his own singular truth as an artist in his artistic conscience, breaks within himself one of the springs, the sacred springs of human conscience. And to that extent, he wounds moral conscience itself. We have spoken of the values which refer to the order of formal causality and of specification, of the ends and the ultimate end, which refer to the order of final causality and of exercise. We have also spoken of moral obligation. Now, by what means does man become able to enforce in actual existence moral standards and moral regulations, or to make his actions consonant with reason? Here we are confronted with the notion of moral virtue. Virtues, as perennial philosophy sees them, are stable dispositions or inner forces developed in the soul, which perfect its operative powers in a certain line or direction. Moral virtues, say the four cardinal virtues, prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance, recognized by Greco-Roman philosophical tradition, perfect and fortify the intellect, the will, and the appetitive powers in the line of morality. They are connected with one another, but the principal of them, the queen of moral virtue, is prudence, that is, practical insight and wisdom, because it has to do with the intellect and the command of our actions. The main point to be made in respect to prudence is that prudence is, like art, though in the sphere of doing, not of making. Prudence is a virtue of the intellect, of the practical intellect. But it is in no way science, even a practical science. Prudence is not a set of ready-made general truths and general rules. particularized as they may be, to apply moral rules. There is no fixed and ready-made rule to apply the rules. The only definitive rule is the very rectitude of the appetite. The act of moral choice is so individualized both by the singularity of the person from whom it emanates and by that of the context of contingent circumstances in which it takes place, that the practical judgment in which it is expressed and by which I declare to myself, this is what I need, can only be right if actually, hic et nunc, the dynamism of my will is right and tends toward the genuine goods of human life. So much for the ruling and dominating part, the royal part, played by the virtue of prudence, both intellectual and moral, in human life. But we know that art is another virtue, intellectual, not moral, of the practical intellect, in that it is concerned with the good of the work, not with the good of man. At this point, we meet with the relationship and the conflict between art and prudence. The artist, as an artist, has ends which deal with his work and the good of his work, not with human life. The artist, as a man, has ends which deal with his own life, in the good of his own life, not with his work. If he took the end of his art, or the good of his artifact, for his own supreme good and ultimate end, he would be but an idolater. Art, in its own domain, is sovereign, like wisdom. Through its object, it is subordinate neither to wisdom nor to prudence nor to any other virtue. But by the subject in which it exists, by man and in man, it is subordinate, extrinsically subordinate, to the good of the human subject. As used by man's free will, art enters a sphere which is not its own, but the sphere of moral standards and values, and in which there is no good against the good of human life. Whereas art is supreme with respect to the work, prudence, that is moral wisdom, the virtue of right practical decision, prudence is supreme with respect to man. What makes the conflict bitter is the fact that art is not subordinate to prudence by virtue of their respective objects, as science, for instance, is subordinate to wisdom. As concerns its own objects, everything comes under the purview of art, and of art alone. But as concerns the human subject, nothing comes under art's purview. Over anything made by the hand of man, art and prudence each claim dominion. From the point of view of poetic, or if you will, working values, prudence is not competent. From the point of view of human values and of the moral regulation of the free act, prudence alone is competent, and there is no limitation upon its rights to govern. When he reproves the work of art, the prudent man, standing squarely upon his moral virtue, has the certitude that he is defending against the artist a sacred good, the good of man, and she looks upon the artist as a child or a madman. Perched on his intellectual virtue, the artist has the certitude that he is defending a no less sacred good, the good of beauty, and he looks as though he were bearing down on the prudent man with the weight of Aristotle's maxim, life proportioned to the intellect is better than life proportioned to man. From the point of view of art, the artist is responsible only to his work. From the point of view of morality, to assume that it does not matter what one writes is permissible only to the insane. The artist is responsible to the good of human life, in himself and in his fellow men. Thus, that which we are confronted with is the inevitable tension, sometimes the inevitable conflict between two autonomous worlds, each sovereign in its own sphere. Morality has nothing to say when it comes to the good of the work or to beauty. Art has nothing to say when it comes to the good of human life. Yet, human life is in need of that very beauty and intellectual creativity, where art has the last word. And art, on the other hand, exercises itself in the midst of that very human life, those human needs and human ends, where morality has the last word. In other words, it is true that art and morality are two autonomous worlds, each sovereign in its own sphere, but they cannot ignore or disregard one another, for man belongs in these two worlds, both as intellectual maker and as moral agent, doer of actions which engage his own destiny. And because an artist is a man before being an artist, the autonomous world of morality is simply superior to and more inclusive than the autonomous world of art. There is no law against the law on which the destiny of man depends. In other words, art is indirectly and extrinsically subordinate to morality. Excuse me, still 5 minutes. A last question. I would like to tackle a last question, which essentially matters to the realm of morality. Namely the question, what does the perfection of human life consist of? Our preceding considerations make us expect the answer that Thomas Aquinas offers. Anything, he says, is called perfect insofar as it reaches its proper end. For in the attainment of the end consists the ultimate perfection of a thing. Now, it is through charity that we are united with God, who is the ultimate end of man. Because, as St. John puts it, God is love, and he that abideth in love abideth in God, and God abideth in him. Therefore it is in charity, when there is no longer any obstacle to its expansion in the soul, that the perfection of man consists. Thus St. Thomas teaches that perfection consists in charity, and that each of us is bound to tend toward the perfection of love, according to his condition and insofar as it is in his power. All morality thus hangs upon love. The love of that which is better than all goodness is that in which man attains the perfection of his being. That perfection does not consist in supreme accuracy, in copying an ideal. It consists in loving, in going through all that is unpredictable, dangerous, dark, demanding, and insensate in love. It consists in the plenitude and refinement of dialogue and union of person with person to the point of transfiguration, which, as St. John of the Cross puts it, make of man a God by participation. Two natures, he says, in a single spirit and love. If the perfection of human life consisted in some stoic athleticism of moral virtue and in a man-made righteousness achieved to the point of impeccability, all of us, and especially the artist and the poet, would be in a rather sad predicament in this regard, and would have to despair of the possibility of one single wise man, as the late Stoics did. But if the perfection of human life consists in a ceaselessly increasing love, despite our mistakes and weaknesses, between the uncreated self and the created self, there is some hope and some mercy for all of us, and especially for the artist and the poet. I am obliged here to refer to matters which go beyond philosophy and pertain to the theological sphere. I cannot do otherwise, because the realm of morality deals with man as he is, not only in his abstract essence, but also in his concrete and existential condition. And because the existential condition of man is not purely natural. In relation to this existential condition, there are certain data, the knowledge of which depends on theology, not on philosophy. One of these data has to do with the virtues which come into play in the conduct of human life, and with that love of charity of which I just spoke. As a matter of fact, there are other virtues besides moral virtues to be taken into consideration. These other virtues, which are faith, hope, and charity, are God-given virtues and are called theological virtues, for God himself is their object. And the greatest, as St. Paul puts it, is charity. Thus it is that, fortunately for man, and fortunately for the artist, prudence is indeed the queen of moral virtues. But this queen has been made into a servant with respect to charity. The only real queen of all virtues is charity, or that God-given love for God and our fellow man, which is God's love itself communicated to us. In the order of nature, there is no friendship possible, as Aristotle observed, between Jupiter and man, because friendship presupposes a kind of equality. But in the order of grace, precisely because grace raises man to share in the very life of God, there is between man and God real friendship, with that relationship from person to person and that community of goods which friendship implies. This love of friendship uniting God and man is grace-given charity. Charity does not cancel the need for prudence and moral virtues. It requires them. In one sense, it carries them along with itself in the soul, and it perfects them. But charity transfigures moral life and changes entirely the picture, because it makes man intrinsically good, and it makes him love the law, since he has become the friend of the author of the law. Thus, moral law, which condemns us and is our enemy as long as we are wicked, becomes itself our friend and our road to freedom. And at the end, when charity has transformed man, charity makes man accomplish the law without being enslaved to the law, because he does freely, by love, what the law prescribes. Though charity does not abolish the conflict between prudence and art, yet it enables man, if it takes hold of him, to solve this conflict in freedom, and to have art quickened by love, accord with prudence, not as an enemy queen, but as a friendly servant of charity.